This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
About the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
I want to start just with a pretty simple question, but a deceptively simple one, which is just to ask, what is the World Cup, right? And what have we defined this thing that this object we're trying to talk about? And I'm of course going to start inevitably with a little history. It's probably a lot of this is well known to you, but I think it's worth recalling all of the kind of things that made the World Cup in South Africa symbolically loaded and a particularly important thing, and not only for South Africa, but in the broader history of global football. As you probably know, the first World Cup was in Uruguay in 1930, and it was largely the creation of a World War I veteran and mediocre but enthusiastic football player named Jules Rimet, a Frenchman. And it was from the beginning infused with a rather utopian idea that was part of the broader internationalism of the post-World War I moment. Namely that a set of national competitions or conflicts on the football field would be a much better way a better site for these conflicts than the field of war itself. By the late 1930s, one optimistic commentator described the World Cup as a kind of living United Nations, and it was so it's infused from the beginning with the kind of rhetoric that we're of course flooded with through FIFA propaganda today about this as this kind of site of international understanding and cooperation, a kind of alternative space. Though by the 1950s and 1960s, it was rapidly becoming and finally installed itself as kind of the world's largest sporting event, right? Kind of outstripping in some ways the Olympics for that title. And in the beginnings, it was almost exclusively European and Latin America, kind of necessity. But by the 1960s, that of course began to change, in particular because of the decolonization of Africa. And that's sort of the beginning of the story that leads to the South African World Cup, which was that during the 1960s, African nations, very rapidly, one of the first things they would do, and the two first things was to join the UN and join FIFA, right? Like the two most important movements. And nevertheless, the inclusion in FIFA was relatively slow, and a lot of scholars have pointed out FIFA had to be decolonized. FIFA was a heavily European organization. By 1966, there were 16 slots in the World Cup, and there was one reserved for either an African or an Asian team. The best from the two continents had to compete for that one slot. In that year, Kwame Nkrumah led a boycott of the World Cup, which resulted in North Korea that didn't follow the boycott going to this World Cup and defeating Italy in one of its famous upsets. But because of that, FIFA began to sort of expand the number of slots for African teams. And that was, again, one of the moments of political change within the organization. Now, by the 1970s, a kind of real shift in the history of FIFA and in the history of African football. By the 1970s, Brazilian João Havelange began to campaign for president of FIFA. And he did so in part by really reaching out to African countries, essentially getting the votes of African members in order to become president. And that began a kind of process of relationship between FIFA and now, I'll just mention briefly the role of South Africa within this broader history, which is a significant one, since although FIFA has actually largely shies away in many ways from political choices, there's a big exception with South Africa, which is that South Africa, under pressure from the Confederação Africana de Football, both first suspended South Africa in the 1960s and eventually expelled them from FIFA in the 1970s because they refused to send integrated teams to the World Cup. And so this was a kind of success of the African Federation and a kind of big moment in terms of obviously the history of FIFA, but also the relationship with other boycotts in South Africa. And it's only in 1998 that they begin coming back to the World Cup, at which time South Africa joins other African nations in lobbying very strongly for an African World Cup, for a World Cup within Africa. The first World Cup that's outside of Europe is in 2002 in Asia and Korea and Japan. And so it was originally going to be in 2006 and South Africa was actually put off for 2010. But it was just to say it was a kind of culmination of a long set of efforts to change in some ways the culture of FIFA. Right? And I'm sure you've heard about all this as the World Cup approach.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.